Deaf mute single dad waiter is humiliated until a lonely millionaire changes everything forever. Before anything else, if you're watching this from a place of struggle, know that you're not alone. Drop a heart below. Ryan Calloway was 34 years old, and he had learned early in life that the world was not built for men like him. Not because he lacked strength, and he had plenty of that, carved from years of early mornings and late nights, of hauling trays through crowded dining rooms and smiling through the kind of exhaustion that settled into a man's bones like cold weather. Not because he lacked intelligence. He read people the way scholars read books, studying the micro-expressions that flashed across faces before anyone thought to hide them, tracking lip movements with the precision of a musician trained by ear. No, the world was simply not built for men who could not speak and could not hear. Men who lived in a permanent, beautiful, suffocating silence. He had been deaf and mute since birth, a condition his mother had wept over, his grandmother had prayed over, and his father, well, his father hadn't stayed long enough to have an opinion. Ryan had grown up in Dayton, Ohio, in a cramped apartment that smelled like old carpet and his grandmother's lavender candles. Learning sign language before he learned to write his own name. Learning to read lips because the world moved too fast to wait for him to catch up. By the time he was a teenager, he could watch a conversation from across a parking lot and tell you every word being exchanged. It wasn't a trick, it wasn't performance. It was survival, elevated to an art form. Now he lived in Cincinnati in a one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator worked 3 days out of 7. The radiator in the hallway made sounds at night that Isabella, his 6-year-old daughter, had decided were caused by a friendly ghost she'd named Chester. Ryan had not corrected her. He liked that she found magic in the ordinary. He liked that about her more than he could have expressed even if he'd had a voice. Isabella. She was the whole architecture of his world. The reason he laced up his shoes every morning before 6. The reason he climbed those stairs without complaint even when his legs ached. The reason he pressed his uniform until the creases were sharp enough to cut glass. She had her mother's dark curls and his mother's stubborn chin, and eyes so bright and attentive that strangers often stopped to comment on them. She was 6 years old, and she was extraordinary in ways that even Ryan, her father, hadn't yet fully understood. She had started reading at 3. Not picture books. Actual reading, sounding out words on cereal boxes and street signs and the closed captions on the television Ryan kept muted out of habit. By 4, she was writing him little notes and leaving them on the kitchen counter before school. "Daddy, I saved you the last orange. Love, Bella." By 5, she had taught herself basic sign language from a library book because she wanted to talk to him in his language, not just hers. Now, at 6, she sat beside him on the couch each evening, translating the news broadcast by reading the captions aloud, then asking questions that made Ryan's chest tighten with something that lived between pride and sorrow. Her mother, Diane, had left when Isabella was 14 months old. There had been no dramatic scene, no shouted accusations, or if there had been, Ryan hadn't heard them. He'd come home one Tuesday afternoon to find a note on the kitchen table and a closet half emptied. The note said she loved him, that she loved Isabella, but that she couldn't do this life anymore. He had held that note for a long time, sitting on the edge of the bed, reading the words over and over, running his thumb across her handwriting. Then he had folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer of his nightstand, and gone into the other room to check on his daughter. He had not heard from Diane since. He worked at Aurelius, one of Cincinnati's most celebrated fine dining restaurants, perched on the 14th floor of a downtown tower with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Ohio River. It was the kind of place where the breadbasket alone cost more than Ryan's hourly wage. Where executives sealed deals over $40 glasses of wine and politicians celebrated re-elections with Wagyu beef and truffle-shaved pasta. Where tips, on a good night, could carry a man through the week. Ryan had been there for 4 years. He was, by every measurable standard, an exceptional waiter. He anticipated orders before they were given. He sensed when a table needed space and when they needed attention. He remembered dietary restrictions without being told twice. He communicated through a small laminated card he kept in his breast pocket, which explained his condition in polite, concise language. And through the notepad he used to take orders when guests were uncomfortable with his sign language. Most regular patrons had come to appreciate him. Some even requested his section. But there were always the others. The Thursday evening in late October, when everything changed, began like most evenings. Ordinary. Crisp. The city lights beginning to blink on outside the panoramic windows as the dinner rush approached. Ryan adjusted his cuffs in the staff mirror, checked his name badge, and pushed through the kitchen doors into the dining room. He did not know that a woman was about to walk through the front entrance who would, over the next several weeks, dismantle every wall he'd spent years constructing around his heart. He did not know that his daughter's life, and his own, was about to change in ways he could not have imagined from the quiet, careful distance he kept from the world. He only knew that Table 7 was expecting a party of 4, that the evening special was a pan-seared halibut with saffron beurre blanc, and that Chester the ghost had apparently rattled the radiator particularly loudly that morning because Isabella had left him a note that read, "Chester says good luck at work, Daddy. I think he likes you." Ryan had smiled at that note for the entire 40-minute bus ride downtown. He was still smiling faintly when the hostess at the front podium straightened her posture and the main doors opened. He didn't look up immediately. He was refilling the water at Table 9, moving with the quiet efficiency that had become his signature, unhurried, precise, invisible in the best professional sense of the word. Then something made him glance toward the entrance. Perhaps it was the subtle shift in the room's energy, the way 3 or 4 heads turned simultaneously, a social cue he'd learned to track the way others tracked sound. Or perhaps it was something else entirely, something he wouldn't have been able to name. The woman who walked in wore a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse the color of deep water, and she moved through the room as though she had long ago decided that hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. She was young, younger than her posture suggested, with dark hair swept back and eyes that scanned the room with the efficient, measuring quality of someone accustomed to assessing situations quickly. She was alone. No assistant, no date, no entourage. Just herself, and a quiet confidence that managed to fill the space around her without demanding attention. She was, Ryan noted, the most carefully composed and privately sad person he had seen in a long time. He could tell, not from anything she did overtly, but from the things she controlled almost perfectly. The slight tension at the corner of her jaw, the way her eyes moved across the room and then returned, almost imperceptibly, to a fixed middle distance. The practiced quality of her almost smile when the hostess greeted her. Ryan had spent his life reading the language beneath language, and what this woman's body was saying beneath all that polish was very clear. She was holding something heavy, and she had been holding it alone for a long time. Her name, as he would learn from the reservation card the hostess consulted, was Olivia Hartwell, and she was about to sit in his section. Olivia Hartwell had built Hartwell Capital from a desk in her childhood bedroom in Louisville, Kentucky, with $30,000 borrowed from her father, and an iron-willed certainty that she understood value in ways the market had not yet learned to see. She was 29 years old, and in the previous 7 years she had turned that $30,000 into a portfolio that financial publications described with words like staggering and unprecedented. She had appeared on 4 magazine covers. She had been called the sharpest mind in mid-market private equity by people who were paid to know. None of that meant anything to her tonight. Tonight was her private, unspoken anniversary, the first Thursday following her mother's birthday, the date she allowed herself one dinner alone to sit with the grief she kept locked away every other day of the year. She had come to Aurelius for the same reason she came every year, because her mother had loved this restaurant. Because sitting here at a corner table with a view of the river felt like the closest thing to a conversation she could still have with the woman she missed most in the world. Eleanor Hartwell had died 22 months ago, after 14 months of battling a cancer that had moved with cruel swiftness through a body that had spent 61 years being strong for everyone around it. Olivia had been at her bedside. She had held her mother's hand for the last 6 hours, talking to her in a low voice about everything and nothing, about the garden they were going to plant in the spring, about the trip to Vermont they had always meant to take, about the smell of her lemon cake on Sunday mornings. She had not told anyone how badly she was still broken by it. Not her board members, not her attorneys, not the handful of people she might have called friends if she'd allowed herself the vulnerability. Grief, Olivia had decided, was a private room, and she kept its door locked. It was the only way she knew how to function. She settled into the corner table, ordered a glass of burgundy, and opened the small worn notebook she brought with her every year to this dinner. Inside were pages of her mother's handwriting, grocery lists, phone numbers, a half-finished crossword puzzle, the lyrics to a hymn Eleanor had loved. Olivia didn't read them tonight. She simply laid the notebook on the table beside her wine glass, the way you set a photograph on a shelf, not to look at, just to have near. She was studying the menu when she became aware of a disturbance at the table directly across from hers. The table held 3 men, mid-50s. Expensive suits, the well-fed confidence of men who had never seriously doubted their own importance. One of them, broad-shouldered with silver hair and the particular brand of loudness that came from never having been told to be quiet, was trying to get the attention of their waiter. He was snapping his fingers. The waiter was Ryan Calloway. He stood at the table with his small laminated card extended, and Olivia watched the silver-haired man read it, lean back, and say something to his companions that made all 3 of them smirk. She could not hear what he said from across the room, but she watched his lips move. And then she watched Ryan's face, and what she saw there, the specific quality of stillness that a man produces when he is absorbing an insult and choosing, deliberately, not to react, made something cold move through her chest. She had built a career on reading rooms. She had negotiated with hostile boards and navigated spaces designed to make her feel small. She recognized the architecture of contempt when she saw it. The silver-haired man was saying something again, louder now, performing for his companions. He gestured at Ryan's notepad with theatrical impatience, then mimed writing with exaggerated slowness, elbowing his colleague with a grin. The third man, to his credit, looked slightly uncomfortable. The second man laughed. Ryan wrote down their order without visible reaction. His posture did not change. His expression did not crack. He turned from the table with the same professional composure he had carried all evening, and only Olivia, sitting in the direct line of his path back to the kitchen, saw the brief, unguarded moment that crossed his face when he was no longer being watched by the table that had just humiliated him. It lasted less than 2 seconds, a flicker of something exhausted and old, like a man who has been pushing against a door for years and has almost stopped expecting it to open. Then it was gone. He straightened. He moved toward the kitchen. And as he passed her table close enough that she could have spoken to him, Olivia found herself doing something that surprised her. She looked up from the menu. She made eye contact with him. And she nodded, a small, deliberate nod that said, without any possibility of misinterpretation, "I saw what happened, I see you." Ryan stopped, just for a fraction of a second. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, not gratitude, not suspicion, but something more careful than either. Then he continued toward the kitchen. Olivia sat with that moment for a while, turning it over in her mind the way she turned over investment propositions, looking for what it revealed about the nature of the thing. 20 minutes later, when Ryan returned to her table to take her order, she had put the menu aside and was ready. She made eye contact immediately, and she spoke clearly, without exaggeration but with careful enunciation. "The halibut, please, and however the chef recommends it." She paused, then added, "You're very good at what you do. I wanted you to know that." She said it plainly, without inflation or the slightly panicked over-warmth people sometimes deployed when trying to compensate for other people's cruelty. Just a fact, stated as a fact. Ryan wrote something on his notepad and turned it toward her. It read, "Thank you, genuinely." And then, below that, in handwriting that was neat and unhurried, "Most people don't notice the difference between a good waiter and a quiet one." Olivia read it twice. Then she looked up at him. Something in his eyes, the particular quality of intelligence she recognized because she spent her life surrounded by it, made her feel for the first time in a very long while that she was in the presence of someone she did not yet understand, and very much wanted to. "I think I owe you an apology," she said, "on behalf of the people at that table, even though I have nothing to do with them." He wrote, "No apology needed, but I appreciate you seeing it." He returned to the next table. Olivia watched him for a moment, then looked back down at her mother's notebook. For the first time in many Octobers, the private weight of this dinner felt fractionally lighter. She did not examine why. She simply ordered dessert, the chocolate fondant her mother had always chosen, and allowed herself the small luxury of feeling less alone. Outside, the Ohio River moved in darkness below the tower, and the city hummed with 1,000 ordinary sounds that Ryan Calloway had never heard, and Olivia Hartwell had long since stopped noticing. Somewhere across town, in a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor, a 6-year-old girl named Isabella was very likely still awake, listening to Chester rattle the radiator and composing her next note in careful, determined handwriting. Neither of the two people in that restaurant knew yet what the next 3 weeks would bring. They did not know about the school meeting that would change everything. They did not know about the document Olivia's attorney would discover during a routine contract review. They did not know about the photograph hidden inside an old book in Ryan's nightstand, the photograph he had found 6 months ago and not yet known what to do with. All they knew in that moment was the small warmth of having been briefly genuinely seen. And sometimes, that is how everything begins. The following Tuesday morning was the kind that arrives gray and purposeful in late October in Ohio. The sky the color of old pewter, leaves plastered flat against the wet sidewalks. Ryan walked Isabella to school, their hands linked, Isabella chattering in the fluid mix of spoken English and sign language they had developed together over 6 years, a private grammar that belonged only to them. She was telling him about a dream involving Chester the ghost and a talking elevator. He signed back questions and she answered with great seriousness. She was wearing a yellow rain jacket over her school uniform, and she had insisted on choosing her own rain boots, which were printed with small green frogs. Ryan had drawn a small frog on a post-it and stuck it to her lunchbox that morning. And she had found it and signed "I love you" so quickly, her small hands blurred. He watched her disappear through the doors of Riverside Elementary and stood on the sidewalk for a moment after, the way parents do, holding the space where the child just was, adjusting to the ordinary ache of watching them move into a world that is partly beyond your reach. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, the floor manager at Aurelius. "You've got a message waiting at the host stand. Someone called for you this morning. Left a number." Ryan frowned. No one called the restaurant for him. His emergency contact was his neighbor, Mrs. Paulson, a retired schoolteacher who kept a spare key and occasionally fed Isabella breakfast when Ryan worked double shifts. He texted back asking for the number, then stood at the bus stop with the gray sky pressing down, trying to account for who would have called a restaurant to reach a deaf man. He arrived at Aurelius 2 hours before his shift to pick up the number. The hostess, a young woman named Carrie who had worked with him long enough to be comfortable with their system, handed him a slip of paper with a phone number and a name, Olivia Hartwell, and below the name in Carrie's handwriting, "She says she wants to talk about something important. She says it's not about the restaurant." Ryan stood with the slip of paper for a long moment. Then he folded it and placed it in his breast pocket, beside the laminated card that explained his silence to the world. He spent the first hour of prep service thinking about it, with one half of his attention, while the other half moved trays and polished glasses and confirmed the evening's reservations. Olivia Hartwell. He had looked her up after that Thursday dinner, not out of anything he would have called interest. Exactly, but because she had looked at him with that careful, deliberate regard, and he was a man who noticed things, and what he'd noticed was something he didn't have an immediate explanation for. What he'd found online had been substantial. Hartwell Capital, 29 years old. Louisville born. Self-made in the specific, grinding way that people rarely were anymore. Several articles mentioned a personal tragedy, the death of her mother, Eleanor Hartwell, nearly 2 years prior. One profile described Olivia as guarded in the way of people who have learned that openness is expensive. Ryan had read that line twice. He understood expensive openness very well. At 6:30 that evening, during a lull between the early and late dinner seating, he texted the number from the slip of paper. He identified himself, explained that he communicated primarily through text, and asked what she had wanted to discuss. Her response came within 4 minutes. "Mr. Calloway, thank you for texting. I'll be direct. I have a business proposal I'd like to discuss with you. I know that sounds strange given that we've spoken once, but I believe you have a professional skill that my company could use, and I'd like to offer you a consulting contract. No obligation to accept. I'd simply like the chance to explain it properly. Would you be willing to meet? Ryan read it 3 times. Then he typed, "What skill?" She replied, "Lip reading. I run an investment firm. I recently lost a contract because of information communicated in a private conversation I had no access to. Your ability, given what I observed Thursday, is extraordinary. I need someone who can do what you do in a legitimate professional capacity. I'm not asking you to do anything dishonest. I'll explain further if you agree to meet." He stood with his phone in his hand and looked out through the small porthole window in the kitchen door. At the dining room full of people whose mouths moved constantly, whose words he caught in fragments and pieces. The laughing man at table 12 saying something about a boat. The couple at table 3 negotiating about something that was clearly not about the menu. The 2 women at table 15. One of whom was saying slowly and without moving her head, "I can't keep doing this, I'm telling you right now." He had never thought of what he could do as a skill that belonged in a business context. He had thought of it the way he thought of the ability to walk, something you developed because you needed it. Not because it was remarkable. He typed, "When and where?" She replied with an address and a time, Saturday morning 10 o'clock, a coffee shop on the edge of Hyde Park. Then she added, "There's something else I'd like to ask you about, something more personal, but only if you're comfortable. The professional matter is entirely separate from it." He stared at the second message for a long time. Something more personal. He had learned over 34 years to be cautious with that phrase. People who led with it were usually building to something he hadn't been told yet. But he thought about Isabella, and the school meeting he had scheduled for the following week. The one with her teacher and the school psychologist and a specialist from the district. The one convened because Isabella's performance in first grade had been so far beyond grade level that the school had asked to discuss options. He thought about what those options might cost and what his current salary covered, and the gap between those 2 numbers. He thought about the photograph in his nightstand that he still hadn't figured out what to do with. He typed, "Saturday at 10 works. I'll be there." He placed the phone in his pocket and walked back into the dining room, moving through the tables with his customary precision, and tried to settle the unquiet thing that had started moving in his chest. He failed mostly, but he kept it invisible. He was very good at that. 2 miles away in a glass and steel building near Fountain Square, Olivia Hartwell sat at her desk after everyone else had gone home and looked at the document her attorney had flagged in a contract review 3 days earlier. A small thing on the surface. A discrepancy in the subsidiary filings of a company they were considering for acquisition. A name that appeared in 2 different documents in a way that suggested either a clerical error or something that was decidedly not a clerical error at all. The name, both times, was Diane Calloway. She had not yet told Ryan. She did not know yet what it meant. She only knew that the woman listed as a minor shareholder in a subsidiary of the company she was acquiring shared a last name with the deaf waiter who had looked at her across a restaurant dining room with exhausted, intelligent eyes. It was probably nothing. The world was full of coincidences. Olivia Hartwell had built her entire career on not believing in coincidences. She turned back to her desk, then stood at the window. The city below was alive in the way it always was at this hour. Delivery trucks, late cabs, the orange glow of streetlights pooling on wet pavement. She had grown up poor enough to think that people who worked in buildings like this one were a different species. Now she was that person, and she still sometimes felt the dislocation of having arrived somewhere she had aimed for without ever being certain she belonged. Her mother had told her once, sitting at the kitchen table in Louisville with a cup of tea, that belonging was not a place you arrived at. It was a practice. Like prayer, she'd said. You did it daily, imperfectly, and it accumulated into something that held. Olivia had not practiced it well. The months following her mother's death had hardened something in her that she hadn't yet found the tool to soften. She had poured everything into work, because work was concrete and did not require her to sit with the shapeless ache of grief at 2 a.m. when there was no deal to close and no version of busy that could fill the silence left by someone who had known you your whole life. She looked at the document one more time. Diane Calloway. The name sat on the page with the flat patience of a fact waiting to be understood. She did not know Ryan Calloway. She had no reason to involve herself further in his life beyond the professional arrangement she had proposed, and yet she thought about the way he had stood at that table while those men performed their contempt at his expense. The specific quality of dignity required to absorb that and not break posture. She had met senators and surgeons and self-made billionaires who did not possess it. It was not built with money or status. It was built in the silences that other people couldn't tolerate. She picked up her phone. The Calloway name in the Meridian subsidiary filing. Don't act on it yet. I want to understand what it means. Give me until Monday. Her attorney responded immediately. Understood. Dig deeper or hold. She typed. Hold. Don't mention it to anyone on the acquisition team. She set the phone down, gathered her coat, and turned off the desk lamp. In the sudden dark, the city outside became the only light in the room. 1,000 small bright points like a map of all the places where people were still awake, still carrying their weights through their private silences. She found herself hoping that Ryan Calloway made it home safely, that his daughter was dreaming something good. She found herself hoping it the way you hope for people who have already, somehow, begun to matter. And the thing Olivia didn't know, couldn't know not yet, was that the document on her desk was not the biggest thing she was about to find. There was something else coming. Something that would not arrive through a contract review or an attorney's memo. Something that was going to arrive the way the most important things always do. Quietly, suddenly, and without warning. We're past the halfway point now, and I promise you, what's coming will stay with you. If you've been here since the beginning, thank you. Drop a comment and let me know what you think of Ryan and Olivia so far. Your words keep these stories alive. Saturday arrived with a cold clarity that felt almost deliberate. The kind of morning that strips the world down to its essentials. Bare branches against a pale sky. The smell of wood smoke and coffee drifting through Hyde Park. Ryan was there 10 minutes early. As he always was, seated at a corner table with his back to the wall and a clear sight line to the entrance. Old habit. When you cannot hear a door open, you learn to watch for the change in other people's faces. Olivia arrived at exactly 10. She wore a dark wool coat and carried a leather portfolio under one arm, and she moved through the cafe with the same quiet efficiency he'd noticed at the restaurant. No wasted motion, no performance. She spotted him immediately, crossed the room, and sat down across from him without preamble, setting the portfolio on the table between them. Thank you for coming, she said. Slowly and clearly, the way people do when they've prepared. She had prepared. He noticed that too. He nodded and held up his phone, where he'd typed in advance. I appreciate the directness. Same from me. I don't have a lot of time to waste. Tell me what you're actually proposing. She opened the portfolio and slid a single printed page across the table. It was a contract outline, brief, clean, professionally drafted, consulting agreement, 12 weeks, with option to extend. The rate listed made Ryan read the number twice. It was more than 3 months of his current salary. I attend a lot of meetings, Olivia said, watching his face as she spoke. Board meetings, acquisition negotiations, due diligence calls. In all of those settings, there are conversations that happen in plain sight that no one in my position is supposed to be able to access. Sidebar exchanges, whispered consultations, things said across a room while someone's attention is elsewhere. I lost a significant deal 6 months ago because my counterpart communicated a critical piece of information to his attorney in exactly that way. Someone on his side read the room better than someone on mine. I intend to correct that imbalance. Ryan read the page carefully, then typed, What you're describing is legal. What you're describing is also something that would make a lot of people very uncomfortable if they knew you were doing it. Yes, she said simply. That's why the contract includes a confidentiality clause in both directions. You don't discuss my business. I don't discuss your involvement. It's that straightforward. He looked at her for a long moment. In the language of faces, the one he'd been reading his entire life, she was telling the truth, not performing honesty, actually delivering it. He typed, You said there was something personal you wanted to discuss, separate from this. Something shifted in her expression. Not fear exactly, but the careful quality of someone approaching a subject they haven't fully mapped. "I want to ask you about Isabella," she said. "I know about the school meeting next week. I know because I made some inquiries after our conversation at the restaurant. Nothing invasive, publicly available information. Her school filed a district-level request for gifted assessment services 3 weeks ago. Your daughter's name is in the filing." Ryan's hands went still on the table. "I'm not trying to intrude," Olivia continued, her voice steady and her words deliberate. "I have a foundation, education-focused. We fund acceleration programs for children who are identified as profoundly gifted, but whose families don't have access to the kind of resources those children need to develop fully. I'd like to tell you about it, that's all. No obligation, no strings attached to the consulting contract. That stands on its own. I simply thought you deserved to know that options exist." He sat with that for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and typed, slowly, "Why? You don't know us. You saw me for 40 minutes across a dining room." Olivia looked at the question, then she looked at him. And for a moment, the careful composure she wore like a second skin shifted, just slightly, and he saw what lived underneath it. Not weakness, but something old and worn and genuinely felt. "Because someone should have told my mother that options existed," she said quietly. "When I was 9 years old and couldn't stop reading and no one knew what to do with me. She figured it out alone. It took years. It cost her. I've spent the last 4 years trying to make sure other families don't have to do it the way she did." Ryan read her face. He read it the way he read everything, completely without the filter of sound, picking up every signal the body produced when the mouth stopped being in charge. What he saw was someone telling the absolute truth about something that had cost her to say. He looked down at the contract, then he typed, "I'd like to hear about the foundation, and I'll sign the consulting agreement, conditional on one thing. If I ever see something in those rooms that I believe is illegal, I walk. No negotiation." "That's already in the contract," she said. "Clause 7. He almost smiled. "Then we have a deal." They talked for 2 more hours. She explained the foundation, the Hartwell Learning Initiative, established in his mother's name 18 months after Eleanor's death, already serving 43 children across Kentucky and Ohio. He listened and asked questions through his phone and watched her face animate in a way it hadn't at the start of the meeting. The careful composure giving way to something more genuine and more compelling. He did not tell her about the photograph in his nightstand. He had meant to bring it up, had rehearsed on the bus ride over, a version of the conversation in which he mentioned it casually as context. But something stopped him. Not distrust. Something more like the instinct that tells you a door should be opened carefully, and only when you're ready for what might be on the other side. He left the coffee shop at noon, standing on the sidewalk in the cold with the signed contract in his jacket pocket, and texted his neighbor, Mrs. Paulson, to confirm she could watch Isabella that evening. Then he stood for a moment looking at the bare trees lining the avenue, and allowed himself something he very rarely allowed, the small, dangerous feeling of a door beginning, tentatively, to open. He did not know what was on the other side. He did not know that Olivia, walking in the opposite direction toward her car, was at that same moment opening a file on her phone, the file her attorney had quietly expanded overnight, adding 3 new pages to the Diane Calloway entry in the Meridian subsidiary documents. He did not know what those 3 pages said. He did not know that by Monday morning, when Olivia read them fully, she would sit very still at her desk for a long time before picking up her phone. He did not know that the photograph in his nightstand, the one he'd found tucked inside a copy of Steinbeck he hadn't opened in years, in Diane's handwriting on the back, with a date and an address, was connected to what Olivia's attorney had found, not adjacent to it, not coincidentally near it, directly, undeniably connected. The school meeting happened on Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock in a conference room at Riverside Elementary that smelled like dry erase markers and institutional carpet cleaner. Ryan sat across from Isabella's teacher, Ms. Dorsey, a kind-faced woman in her late 30s who signed several phrases at the beginning of the meeting because she had clearly practiced them. Beside her sat Dr. Patricia Webb, the school psychologist, and Dr. Alan Greer, a specialist from the Cincinnati Gifted Education Consortium, a tall, unhurried man who had evaluated hundreds of children and whose eyes, when he spoke about Isabella's test results, carried a quality Ryan recognized immediately. Awe. The man was genuinely awed. The results were read aloud and displayed on a printed chart. Isabella had been quietly assessed over 3 sessions during school hours. Reading comprehension, mathematical reasoning, spatial logic, verbal processing, and her scores placed her in the 99th percentile across every category. Not the 99th percentile for her age, 99th percentile overall, benchmarked against children up to 12 years old. Dr. Greer leaned forward and said, with the careful language of someone who had learned to deliver remarkable news gently, Mr. Calloway, your daughter is one of the most profoundly gifted children this consortium has assessed in 11 years of operation. What she has demonstrated, not just in raw score but in her approach to problems, in the way she self-corrects and builds frameworks, is genuinely rare. We are recommending immediate enrollment in the consortium's advanced track. There are scholarships available. We would like to help. Ryan sat very still. He read every lip in the room. He looked at the chart. He looked at his hands. Then he took out his phone and typed, and turned the screen toward Ms. Dorsey to read aloud. I always knew she was something. I just didn't have the language for how much. Ms. Dorsey read it. Her eyes went bright. She nodded, and reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, and said, You gave her everything she needed to become who she is. That doesn't happen by accident. He walked out of the school into the gray November morning and stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold air, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the weight he carried was not purely burden. Some of it was ballast. Some of it had been all along holding him steady so that he could hold her steady, and she had used that steadiness to become something extraordinary. He texted Olivia. 3 words. She's profoundly gifted. Olivia replied in under a minute. I know, tell me everything. They met that evening. For the first time outside of a professional context at a quiet restaurant in Clifton. Nothing like Aurelius, a neighborhood place with mismatched chairs and good soup and a proprietor who knew enough to leave tables alone. Ryan had left Isabella with Mrs. Paulson and brought his phone and his notepad and the printed copy of the assessment results, which Olivia read in full silence, turning each page with the careful attention of someone who understood what she was looking at. When she finished, she set the papers down and said, The foundation can cover everything. Full scholarship, tutoring resources, program access through high school. No conditions. No reporting requirements beyond a yearly check-in. This is exactly what the initiative exists for. He typed, I want to understand why you're doing this. The consulting arrangement was professional. This is something else. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Because 3 weeks ago I walked into a restaurant feeling like the loneliest person in a city of 300,000 people. And a man I had never met looked at me from across a dining room and saw something I had not shown anyone in 2 years. She paused. That kind of thing asks something of you. I'm still figuring out what. Ryan looked at her for a long time. Then he typed, There's something I need to show you. I should have brought it Saturday. I've been carrying it for 6 months and I don't know what to do with it. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed on the table between them a photograph. It was a printed photograph, slightly worn at the corners, the kind you make at a drugstore kiosk. On the front, a woman, mid-30s, dark-haired, standing in front of a building Ryan didn't recognize. On the back, in Diane's handwriting, a date from 4 years ago and an address. And below the address, a name. Olivia picked it up. She looked at the front. Then she turned it over and read the back, and the color left her face. Not gradually. Suddenly, completely the way it does when something you have been trying to hold apart in your mind collapses into a single devastating truth. Ryan, she said. Her voice was different. Lower. She set the photograph down with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a physical shock. Where did you find this? He typed. In a book on my shelf, 6 months ago. Diane's book. She left some things when she went. I don't know when she put it there. I don't know what it means. Olivia looked at the photograph again. Then she looked at him with eyes that had shifted. Still composed, but changed. the careful professional distance replaced by something rawer and more urgent. "The address on the back," she said slowly. "It's my mother's house, in Louisville, my childhood home." She pressed her fingers flat against the table. "And the name written below it, that's my mother's name. Eleanor Hartwell." The restaurant was quiet. Somewhere in the kitchen a pot was set on a burner. The proprietor moved between tables with unhurried purpose. The world conducted itself normally, as it does, regardless of what is happening at any particular table within it. Ryan stared at the photograph. He stared at Olivia's face. He typed, slowly, "Diane knew your mother." "Yes," Olivia said. "She did." She paused, and something behind her eyes worked through a sequence of connections, rapid and precise, the way her mind always moved when something important arrived. "More than knew her. My mother, in the last year of her life, she ran a quiet program. Informal. She called it her project. She identified young mothers in crisis, women who were overwhelmed, who needed support, who were at risk of making decisions they couldn't take back. She helped them. She never told me the details. She said the privacy of the women mattered more than my peace of mind." She looked at Ryan. And then she said the thing that would rearrange everything, the thing that had been sitting in a document on her attorney's desk for a week waiting to be understood. "The company I'm acquiring, the subsidiary where Diane Calloway's name appears, it's a small financial holding vehicle. My mother set it up. It holds a trust." She stopped. She took a breath. "Ryan, the trust has a named beneficiary. It was established 4 years ago, the same year as the date on the back of that photograph. And the beneficiary—" She stopped again. He typed, "Tell me." "The beneficiary," Olivia said, "is Isabella. If you've made it this far, you are exactly the person this story was made for. Before we reach the end, please leave a comment below. Tell me one word that describes how you're feeling right now. One word, that's all. And now, let's finish this together." The silence that followed Olivia's words was the kind that fills a room completely. Not uncomfortable, not empty. The kind of silence that arrives when something enormous has just landed, and both people present need a moment to let it settle into the shape of reality. Ryan looked at the photograph. He looked at Olivia. He looked at his hands. Then he picked up his phone and typed very carefully, "Isabella has a trust that Diane set up through your mother's program 4 years ago." "Yes," Olivia said. He typed, "Why didn't Diane tell me?" Olivia held his gaze. "I don't know yet, but I think, based on what I know about how my mother's program worked, that it may have been because Diane was protecting it. If the trust was listed in Diane's name in a subsidiary your mother established, and the beneficiary was Isabella, she may have wanted to keep it separate from your shared life. Perhaps she wasn't ready. Perhaps she planned to tell you when Isabella was older. Perhaps she left before she found the right moment." She paused. "I don't know which. I may never know. But the trust exists. It is real. And it is substantial." He looked at the table for a long time. 6 months he had carried that photograph. That name and address on the back. That weight of not knowing. 6 months of folding it up and putting it back in the nightstand and telling himself he would figure it out when he had more information. And here was the information, arriving not through any door he had looked for it behind, but through a woman who had walked into a restaurant on a grief anniversary, carrying her mother's worn notebook, and happened to sit in his section. He typed, "How substantial." "Enough," Olivia said carefully, "to cover Isabella's education through postgraduate level. Enough for housing, for resources, for whatever she needs to become, whatever she is capable of becoming. Your mother-in-law, my mother, she didn't do things by halves." Ryan felt something move through him that he couldn't have named in any language. Not grief, not relief, not joy in the simple sense of the word. Something that contained all three and was larger than any of them separately. The feeling of learning that someone you never knew loved your daughter before you even understood how extraordinary your daughter was. The feeling of a protection you didn't know existed being revealed. All at once, like a net you didn't know was there until you needed it. He typed, "Your mother never met Isabella." "No," Olivia said. She died before Isabella would have been brought into the program's sphere, but she set the trust up based on what Diane told her, based on what Diane said about the little girl she'd left behind. Olivia's voice steadied itself over that phrase with visible effort. My mother believed that the children of women in crisis were as much in need of protection as the women themselves. She made provision. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Then he typed, I need you to know something. Diane leaving, I used to think it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. For a long time I believed that. He paused. Then he continued. But Isabella was 14 months old when she left. Everything Isabella is, every book she read, every note she left on the counter, every time she signed I love you before I could blink, all of that happened in a house that was just the two of us. Diane leaving broke something in me, but it also made a space, and we filled that space with something I wouldn't trade for anything in the world. Olivia read the words on his phone screen. She did not say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was level and quiet and honest. My mother would have loved her, she said. She would have absolutely loved her. I think, Ryan typed, that in some ways she already did. The weeks that followed moved with the particular quality of a life reorganizing itself. Not chaotic, but deliberate, like furniture being shifted in a room to let in more light. Ryan signed the consulting contract and attended his first negotiation meeting with Olivia the following Thursday. Sitting quietly at the edge of the conference room while executives talked and gestured and whispered, and reading the room the way he had always read rooms. Completely, fluently, catching 3 exchanges that Olivia later described as significant. Isabella was enrolled in the Hartwell Learning Initiative's Cincinnati cohort the second week of November. She met her new learning coordinator, a young woman named Dr. Simone Hayes, and within 45 minutes had explained to her, in careful detail, her theory about why Chester the ghost probably wasn't malevolent, despite rattling the radiator, which had something to do with the acoustic properties of old pipes and the difference between intention and coincidence. Dr. Hayes called Olivia afterward and said simply, You weren't exaggerating. Ryan and Olivia did not rush anything. They had both learned, in different ways and through different losses, that the valuable things were rarely the fast ones. They met for coffee on Saturday mornings at the cafe in Hyde Park. Sometimes talking about the foundation or the consulting work, sometimes not talking about anything professional at all. She told him about her mother. He told her, slowly and over many weeks, about growing up in Dayton, about his grandmother's lavender candles, about the specific quality of silence in a house where no one else understood sign language. And he had been, for years, genuinely alone inside his own mind. She listened the way she did everything, with complete, unhurried attention. One Saturday in December, 6 weeks after the conversation in the Clifton restaurant, Olivia arrived at the coffee shop to find Ryan already there and beside him, in a yellow coat and frog-printed boots, Isabella. The little girl looked at Olivia with the direct, undefended assessment of a child who has decided to take a person seriously, then picked up her mother's small notebook from the table, the one Ryan must have brought from home, and opened it to a blank page. She wrote in her careful, determined first-grade handwriting, My daddy says you help kids learn things. I already know a lot of things, but I want to know more. Then she looked up and waited. Olivia sat down across from her. She looked at the little girl with the dark curls and the stubborn chin and the eyes that missed nothing. The girl who had taught herself sign language from a library book because she wanted to speak to her father in his own language. The girl who had named a radiator ghost and left post-it frogs on lunchboxes and read captions on a muted television at age 3. The girl whose great-grandmother she had never met had quietly, carefully, loved her across the distance of years and crisis and loss. She picked up the pen. She wrote below Isabella's words, Then we have a lot of work to do. Are you ready? Isabella read it. Her face broke into a grin of such uncomplicated total joy that several people at nearby tables turned to look. The way people always turn when something genuinely good is happening nearby, and some part of them recognizes it before they've consciously registered what they're seeing. She signed something at her father. Ryan watched her hands. His expression did exactly what expressions do when the thing you have been trying to protect most in the world signals. clearly and unmistakably that it is going to be all right. He typed it out for Olivia. She says, "This is the beginning of something important." She says she can tell. Olivia looked at Isabella, and then at Ryan, and then at the worn notebook that had carried her mother's handwriting across 2 years of grief, and one October dinner and one extraordinary chain of improbable, inevitable events. "She's right," Olivia said. She usually is. Outside, Cincinnati moved through its December morning, cold and bright, the river below carrying its endless patient cargo towards somewhere new, the city running its familiar rhythms of urgency and indifference and ordinary life. Inside the coffee shop, a deaf man and a lonely CEO and a 6-year-old girl who already knew more than most people twice her age sat together at a corner table, and the silence between them was not the silence of absence or isolation or loss. It was the silence of a space, finally, fully inhabited. It was the silence of people who had found, not by searching but by the particular grace of showing up honestly in the same place at the same time, that the life they had each been living alone was larger and warmer and more possible than any of them had known how to imagine on their own. And if you listened very carefully, the way Ryan had learned to listen, with everything except his ears, you could almost hear it. The quiet, unhurried sound of something broken beginning, finally, to heal.